All right. Good afternoon, everyone. Jasmine, I am a volunteer on the Philly SHRM committee. We want to thank you for joining today's webinar entitled Neurodiversity in the Workplace. During today's presentation, if you have any questions, please feel free to send them via the question box of the GoToWebinar panel, and we will read them aloud to the speaker at the end of the webinar. We also want to remind you that you are eligible to receive one HRCI general credit and one SHRM professional development credit for attending today's webinar. You will receive a follow-up email after the webinar with a survey link that must be completed for you to receive the certificate for your credits. Once the survey has been completed, the credit forms will be emailed to you within a week. All slides will be sent to all attendees after the webinar. Today's webinar will feature Dr. Tom Edwards, Associate Professor and Director of Engineering Management Program at Temple University. Thank you both for joining us today.
So that sounds like that's my cue.
Mm-hmm.
I do not seem to have control of the screen to move the PowerPoints, so I'm not. So I can start while you guys figure out what I need to do and interrupt me and tell me what to do, so I have control. But good afternoon, and I hope that everyone is well. As Jasmine said, the title of this talk is Neurodiversity in the Workplace. And I'm really looking to accomplish two things today. First, I'm going to try the best that I can to convince you that leading a team, leading a group is a lot like building a jigsaw puzzle. Each piece of a puzzle makes a unique and valuable contribution to the overall picture. What we need to do as leaders is make it possible for each of these pieces to fit in and make their contribution. Secondly, we'll develop a toolkit, the beginnings of a toolkit to help us find a way for everyone to fit in and make their contributions. Any luck on the? I'm just trying to see if I can. Okay, good. All right, I figured it out. All right, so. But first of all, who am I and why should anybody care what I have to say on the topic? So I'm Tom Edwards. I try to combine three perspectives to help people face the challenges of the workplace: experience, research, and teaching. Close that. So I've been leading teams from projects to companies since actually 1983, which is 35 years. I've been teaching others to do this, both graduate students as an adjunct as well as a full-time university professor now, and people who reported to me as well during my industry career for about 23 years. 7 or 8 years ago, I dove into the research literature on leadership as part of a doctorate in management. So I try to combine these three streams of experience, research, and teaching to help those facing these challenges today. And my interest in applying this approach to people facing the additional barrier of neurodiversity was sparked by watching a family member struggle with employment, a family member on the autism spectrum, figuring everything out, getting there, doing a great job, but the employment piece of it is really kind of eluded him. And at one point in time, in a discussion with him, and he's telling me about what was going on at work and whatnot, it finally occurs to me that how these folks are led are part of the problem, that we neurotypical people do not do a good job in providing the appropriate leadership for neurodiverse people. So let me restate my premise. Basic premise was that any kind of a group that you're leading is like a jigsaw puzzle. And as leaders, we got to figure out how each piece fits in and makes their unique and valuable contribution. So my question to the audience, and I know you guys can't answer because you're not in the room with me, but the question would be, does this really sound complicated? I mean, is this rocket science or brain surgery? folks in my classrooms will sometimes argue, you know what, this is just common sense. All right, well, if this is common sense, we should be pretty good at it, right? And if we're good at making it possible for everyone to contribute, then everybody in the workplace should just be fully engaged, just raring to go and doing their utmost to make their contribution. But is this the reality we witness around us? Do we see everyone in our workplace fully engaged and committed to perform? And in my classrooms and live audiences, I'll usually ask people to do a quick poll with a show of hands, and I'll ask, well, how many of you guys think that 90% of American workers are fully engaged and committed? And obviously nobody raises their hands. And then I'll ask 80 and 50, and finally I'll get down to 20%, and I'll get a lot of hands at 20%. So, I mean, there's some good news and bad news in this 20% number. The good news is that number of 20% is low. The bad news is it's not low by much. So every 2 years, the Gallup poll people do a study that they entitle The State of the American Workplace. The results are always the same, so I'm really not sure why they redo it every 2 years, but they do. So the results indicate that only 30% of managers do a great job of getting their followers to be engaged, committed, and motivated to do a great job. 30%. 50% of managers are adequate, and their followers do an adequate job, the bare minimum required to keep their job. They're kind of phoning it in. And the final 20% are so awful, the Gallup report refers to these people as bosses from hell, that followers actually are running around their companies, bad-mouthing their organizations, spreading discontent. In other words, they're so poorly led that they're sabotaging the organizations they work for. So again, if this is common sense, why are we so bad at it? This is a great question, and I wish I had an easy answer, a silver bullet answer, but I don't. Any of us who become leaders, we start down this path, we got to figure this out for ourselves, how to be in the 30% that get it right and not the 50 or the 20. So we all have to figure this out for ourselves, but I can offer some guidelines, a guideline. I rely on the interaction of theory and practice. So let's talk about this, theory and practical experience. Which is better? The better question would be, which is more useful, to have theoretical knowledge or have practical experience? So let me address this by telling a quick story, the story of Ignaz Semmelweis. So Semmelweis was a physician in Austria in the 19th century. And one of the places he worked at was a maternity clinic that had a 20% mortality rate, 20%. So one of every 5 women who checked into this clinic to give birth ended up dying. Is there something wrong with the screen? Okay. Ended up dying. So this compares to a current U.S. rate of 0.02%. This was from a Washington Post article a few weeks ago. And there's a lot of people find that this is unacceptably high. So this was truly a terrible situation. Now, Dr. Semmelweis was a bit of an obsessive note taker. He wrote down everything. And at one point, he he noticed that when he Am I still on the webinar? Hello.
Yes, Tom, you're still on the webinar.
Okay, all right. My screen's doing funny things. I didn't know if I had lost you guys, but okay, I'm still on. Good. So he was a bit of an obsessive note taker, and at one point he noticed that when he excuse me, when he disinfected his hands before seeing patients, the rate of these infections and deaths dropped significantly. So he experimented with this. He expanded his practice, this practice of disinfecting not only his hands, but the rest of the medical staff hand, to every floor on this clinic where he could control it. And he got the same results. So he was obviously encouraged by this. Encouraged is an understatement. And Dr. Semmelweis published his results in 1847 and expected the medical profession to embrace his findings and dramatically improve the quality of maternity medical care. Well, this didn't happen. The medical profession of the 19th century refused to accept these findings. So why did they refuse to accept this? So this story of Ignaz Semmelweis is sometimes used as a case story in medical ethics education. And one of the conclusions that's commonly drawn is that the medical professionals of the 19th century couldn't admit to themselves that they had been the source of this death and suffering. And since they couldn't admit that, they had no basis to change their behavior. They refused to change their behavior. Now, I got to tell you, I don't know if this is right or not. This is way too philosophical for me. I'm more of a practical guy. When I read stories and case studies like this, I always try to look at, what could the doctor have done differently, so that I can learn something from it. And in reading the details of this story of Dr. Semmelweis, the thing that occurred to me is the role of research. Some of Dr. Semmelweis's supporters implored him, they almost begged him to investigate the root cause of this observed phenomenon, the fact that he would disinfect his hands and the death rate would go down. In fact, this was one of the criticisms being leveled at Semmelweis, that what he was reporting was strictly a correlation and there was no causation attached. There was no proof that disinfecting your hands prevented these infections. And Semmelweis steadfastly refused to do this. He dug his heels in. He felt that his findings should stand on their own merit and didn't require this kind of research or theoretical backup. And the thing to realize, to put this into context, is that the time was ripe for him to do this work. The basic tool of this research, microscopy, had been around for 100 years. And the theoretical construct in which it would fit, the germ theory of disease, was already been discussed for decades in Europe, although no one had proven it yet. So the building blocks were available for Dr. Semmelweis to connect his practical experience to a theoretical underpinning of this germ theory of disease. Yet he refused to do it. So today there's a hospital in Vienna, teaching hospital in Vienna, named after Dr. Semmelweis. But at the time, he died penniless in an insane asylum. And his findings were not acted on until 17 years later when Louis Pasteur connected the dots and actually proved the case. So, things ended poorly for Dr. Semmelweis, but the real tragedy here is that it was another 17 years before it was proven. And so there was 17 years, an extra 17 years of needless suffering and death that could have been avoided if Dr. Semmelweis had embraced the concept that you have to connect theory to practice. So to me, the takeaway from the story of Ignaz Semmelweis is that theory and practical experience must work hand in hand. Practical approaches must be informed by the best available theory, and theoretical researchers must consider the experience reported by practitioners of the art. So this is the first of my general guidelines, that theory and practice must work together. Now, I know this seems painfully obvious to us today when we're discussing life sciences or physical sciences. Yet we still ignore the research results into how to effectively work together in our organizations. There's a book that was published a few years ago by two really well-noted business professors, management professors at Stanford University, Pfeffer and Sutton, called The Knowing-Doing Gap. Why do we know so much about how to run organizations well, and why do we do so little of it? So I believe that this gap, that we don't let the research results inform our practice of leadership. This explains the Gallup poll results that we discussed a few minutes ago, that only 30% of us as leaders get this right. All right, so let's try to do this. Let's try to connect theory and practice and connect this to the topic of today's talk, neurodiversity in the workplace. So recall the analogy that I made of the jigsaw puzzle. We need to find a way for each piece to fit in so that it can make its unique and critical contribution to the overall picture. Okay, so I have been the guy I've been the guy who's accountable for the performance of teams since 1983. It's 34 years. And during those 34 years, I've never been part of a unit that focuses on disabilities. I've never been part of a unit that focuses on diversity. And that's not meant to be a criticism of folks who work in those units. They do great work. It's necessary work. It just has not been the reality of my professional experience. Never been measured on how diverse my teams were. Maybe I should have been. Maybe if I was starting my career today, I would be, but the fact is that I wasn't. I've been measured on whether or not my team gets the product designed on time, whether or not the product was designed on budget, whether or not it works, whether or not my business unit makes its revenue and profit numbers. So I've been held accountable for whether or not my team can deliver. I've been accountable for all the pieces of the puzzle working together and delivering the overall picture. So the diversity in abilities, or anything else for that matter, in the teams I have led are a result of the skills and talents I needed to satisfy what could be some pretty demanding expectations. I needed everyone on my team to contribute to the overall picture, and that put the responsibility on me to find a way for everyone to fit in. So let's dive into the details of this topic of neurodiversity and fitting in. So first of all, what is neurodiversity? So it's an evolving term. It's usually meant to include employees on the autism spectrum. That's ASD, autism spectrum disorder, diagnosed with Asperger's syndrome, or perhaps even attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. Okay, there is an 80% unemployment or underemployment rate amongst this population. 80%. So the solution to this unbelievably high unemployment rate, it's a lot of moving parts. The personal contribution I've been trying to make is, how do we as managers, supervisors, adjust our approach to the workplace in order for these folks to fit in and contribute to the overall picture? You know, but the first question you should be asking, and you probably are, is, why is this my problem? The 80% unemployment is certainly of concern to all of us as neighbors, maybe family members, just community members, maybe even as taxpayers. But as professionals responsible for the efficient functioning of organizations, why is it my problem to address this at work? All right, humor me once more while I tell us another story. So this picture is John Elder Robeson. Now, John is currently a professor of neurodiversity at William and Mary College. Before this, John was a very talented electrical engineer. John, in his own words, is an Aspie. He has been diagnosed with Asperger's syndrome. So John is a very talented electrical engineer. He designed the very first circuit that could digitize the human voice. So anytime you're using a telephone service that uses a digitized human voice to help you with solve a problem, that circuit that you're relying on somehow traces its lineage back to John's original invention. John also did some pretty remarkable work for the Department of Defense in terms of signal filtering. There's a lot of interesting things about John, but one of the interesting things is that he dropped out of school in 9th grade because he didn't fit in. He did not fit in socially. He didn't feel like he fit in, and he dropped out. So this highly talented electrical engineer never finished high school. So John's parents were both faculty at a local university where he lived, and all of the security people knew John. So John was able to sneak into the campus and sneak into the electrical engineering labs in the evening, and he taught himself electrical engineering by playing with the lab equipment. This is amazing. As a little bit of an aside here, John also is famous for having designed and built the specialty guitars that shoot smoke and fire and whatever that Gene Simmons of Kiss used on stage. So John actually designed and built those. But when you talk to John about his design work, not the guitars, but the human voice digitizing, you talk to him about how he did that design work, and he talks about visualizing the waveform in his mind. And recall that we're talking about digitizing the human voice. So this is a very complex waveform. And John could hold this in his head and pick up a soldering iron and build the circuit to generate this waveform. Now, I'm an engineer. I don't know how many of you guys are. And I designed a lot of things in my career, but I've never done anything like this. This is an amazing capability. When John told me this, I got to tell you, my original thought was, this is the closest thing I've ever heard to a superpower in the real world. In fact, this story from John inspired the title of my book about leading team members with superpowers. So my hypothetical question to the audience, if you were running an engineering department, what would you do to make sure that John Robeson could fit in? Now, when I talk to my classes of engineering managers, aspiring engineering managers, the answer I get, and it's the right answer, is that they would do anything it takes for him to fit in. The last thing you would want is this type of amazing ability leaving your company and going to the competition because he felt he didn't fit in. This is almost exactly what happened to John. He didn't go down the street to the competition, but he left the engineering profession because he was concerned he wasn't a real engineer. He didn't fit in because he never went to engineering school. What a loss to the profession. So a few minutes ago, I asked the question, why is this my problem? This being the 80% unemployment amongst the neurodiverse. Well, it's not my problem. It's my opportunity. Finding a way for someone like John to fit into the puzzle is what I need to do so that he can make his contribution to the overall picture. Again, the overall picture that I am held accountable for. So I want to give you another example. I'm not sure why I don't have, oh, there we go. So I want to give you another example. In my first assignment as a chief engineer, I was accountable for a team that was designing a flight vehicle, an aerospace vehicle that had to do a very specific mission. So part of what my design team needed to do was a simulation of the flight. So this was a complex mission with multiple vehicles, flight vehicles interacting with each other. So the simulation was pretty involved. And you weren't going to go to the test range and fly this thing for the first time and have something go wrong that you could have fixed through simulation, because if that happened at the test range, it would have been on me. I would have been accountable for it. So there was this engineer in our business, I'm going to call him Bill, who ran these simulations. So he had a computer that took up half a room and it was air conditioned and all this stuff. And he could make this computer work and do these calculations. So one day in an early team meeting, I happened to mention that one of the things on my list was that I needed to get this guy, Bill, involved in our project and do these simulations for us. And one of my team members, Joe, was pretty adamant that Joe, should be the intermediary between Bill and I. I was a little taken back by this. Joe was normally a very low-key kind of guy, but he was really really adamant that he should do this. And the simulation wasn't even his specialty. I think it was communications or something. And it was also a little unusual to have one of my team members be a go-between, an intermediary between me and someone that I needed to do some work on my project. So this fellow, Bill, may be the first person that I ever met who was on the autism spectrum. I didn't realize it at the time, but looking back now, it's likely. So Bill wouldn't look people in the eye. He would look down at his shoes when people talked to him. It wasn't really obvious he was listening to you. His hair and clothes are a little bit off. Not that that's anything. He liked to work in the middle of the night when no one else was around. So it's not definite, but it's likely that Bill was a very, very talented individual that happened to be on the autism spectrum. So Joe, for whatever reason, seemed to have some experience with this. I don't know if he's a family member or what, but Joe seemed to understand this, and I was okay with Joe doing this. So I would tell Joe what I needed to have simulated. Joe would go talk to Bill. I would observe this, and Bill would stare at his shoes and kind of shuffle, and it really wasn't obvious that he was listening to Joe. But then Bill would go off, and he'd work for a couple days in the middle of the night or whatever and come back with the results. But then he wouldn't tell me the results. He would brief Joe with the results, and Joe would brief me. And if I had questions or needed a follow-on simulation, I would ask Joe the questions. Joe would ask Bill. Bill would go do his thing and come back and brief Joe, who would brief me. So as the chief engineer of this project, I was unambiguously accountable for the success of this project. And this man, Bill, could make a unique and invaluable contribution to the overall puzzle. All I had to do was find a way for him to fit in. All I had to do was make actually a pretty minor adjustment in my leadership style, a little bit of understanding, and Bill could contribute to my success based on his deep specific skills. All right, now folks like John Robeson and my buddy Bill from the aerospace industry, they have some pretty impressive deep specific skills. So some folks would be tempted to say, you know, those guys are unusual. Those guys are almost geniuses. So of course you have to make some accommodations. All right, fair enough. So let me impose on you for one more story on this topic. So there's a young woman who's beginning her management career, and I do a little coaching with her. She works in a retail environment. Now, this is a specialty retailer where you really have to know the product well. You have to know how to use the product, and of course, you have to be able to interact with customers. So at her location, there was a young man who worked on the cash registers who appeared to be on the spectrum. Didn't self-disclose, but that was kind of the consensus. Now, this young man was constantly requesting to be moved from the cash register to the sales position. He wanted to be on the sales floor. Most of the managers at the store thought this was really not a good idea. They thought it would be too much for this fellow to handle. But the young woman that I coach, she decided she was going to take a chance on this guy. She told management that she thought this was a good idea and that he could do this job, and she would take him onto her team. So I spoke with her about it after a couple of months, and she said that it had taken a little bit of extra effort to train this guy, but it wasn't that much of a burden. There was a little bit of extra time to train him on the product, the procedures, all that sort of thing. One of the things she did have to work with this guy on that she didn't have to with her other employees, the more neurotypical employees, were in terms of interpersonal issues. You know, things like personal space when you're talking to someone, when not to interrupt someone to ask a question, particularly if that's someone happens to be interacting with a customer. So this sort of thing. So her experience overall with this fellow on her team, though, was pretty good. She said basically she'd tell the guy how to do something or what to do or what not to do once, and he'd get it. So the modification she needed to make to her leadership approach, again, wasn't that big of a deal. And then she discovered the deep specific skill. Now, a retail environment can be pretty complex with procedures for everything. There's a procedure for when to accept the customer return. There's a procedure to decide what to do with it, whether you return it to stock, return it to the vendor, et cetera, et cetera. So what she discovered after a time is that this young man didn't have to stop and consult the 3-ring binder. He could pull the procedure from his memory and follow it exactly while he was interacting with customers in real time. All right, so look, this is not the highly impressive contributions that someone like John Robeson or my buddy Bill from the aerospace industry could make, but it's still a valuable contribution to this business. And this valuable contribution is made possible by what, again, is a pretty minor modification to someone's leadership approach. So this is another example of how a deep specific skill of a neurodiverse employee can contribute to the overall picture if you just put out the effort and find a way for this employee to fit in. Now, on an interesting side note to this story is how the young man reacted to being given this opportunity and then his subsequent success at it. He is 110% committed to working for this company. This is the first time in his life that he's succeeded in employment, and he's thrilled. And his parents are thrilled. And he's thrilled that his parents are thrilled about him. And here's the interesting thing. The team is coalescing around him. The team that this woman leads has embraced this guy, and they support this guy. Now, this is a pretty big payoff in organizational performance and organizational commitment for a pretty small investment in finding a way for someone to fit in. And I should add to this that larger companies like SAP and Microsoft have also seen this increase in organizational commitment of neurotypical employees. When the company goes out of its way and finds a way for neurodiverse people to fit into the company, the commitment, the organizational commitment of neurotypical employees increases, and this has been measured. So let's expand these anecdotes. Let's leave these anecdotes behind and talk about what researchers have found to be the value of neurodiverse employees, right, in the workforce. So they have a keen attention to detail, a willingness to take on repetitive activities that neurotypical employees might not like. They're trustworthy, reliable, low levels of absenteeism. They have an attention to detail and a focus on that detail that can result in them growing into subject matter experts. And here, this is really interesting to me. Most supervisors that have neurodiverse employees on their team rate them as either average or above average performers when they're doing the annual performance review. So Jane Brown, who's an expert on this from Yale University, I was at a recent Autism at Work Summit just 2 weeks ago, where she presented this chart, that these are the following strengths of neurodiverse employees, right? Adherence to rules. There's a lot of jobs where that's very important. Loyalty, trustworthiness, reliability, attention to detail. I would make the argument that these are valuable characteristics for any employee, that we should want to tap into this talent pool of folks with these characteristics. So in addition, major technology firms have begun to recruit neurodiverse talent in order to prove their business performance. So this is what's known as the Autism at Work movement. It was pioneered by SAP, quickly followed by Hewlett-Packard and Microsoft. Since then, there's been others that have joined it. Ernst & Young opened their first Center of Excellence in Neurodiversity right here in their Philadelphia office. And JP Morgan has also initiated a formal neurodiversity program. And look, these companies are not doing this for charity. These companies are looking for the competitive advantage that can be brought to the table by neurodiverse employees. They found that innovation can be sparked by neurodiverse employees, as well as their ability to excel at jobs that require repetitive focus, right? So this makes us think of John Robison and his amazing capability to design things. That would be the ability to innovate. When you think about jobs that require repetitive focus, maybe about 2 months ago, there was an article in the paper where the military in Israel, the Israeli Defense Force, recruited 100 young people on the autism spectrum into the Army, into a special unit in the Army where they interpret aerial photography and satellite photography. Something that requires deep focus. You got to get in the zone and you got to stay there and look for minute differences between photographs. And they found that these guys are really good at that, and they're willing to work through all of the rest of the things that they have to for these guys to fit in, because the military is not an organization that necessarily embraces a diverse way of doing things, right? Everybody wears the same clothes, gets the same haircut. And they see that making the effort to get these guys to fit in gives them an advantage. So one of the unanticipated advantages is, this was found by research at Microsoft, is that as managers, as neurotypical managers, we become better at our jobs once we have neurodiverse employees on our team. Now, we don't really know the reason for this in terms of a research result. The speculation, which makes sense, is that you must be mindful of how you manage the neurodiverse employee, right? You just can't hip shoot it. You got to be thinking about what you're doing. And if you're being mindful for one person on your team, the neurodiverse employee, you're going to be mindful about everybody. How do you manage everyone? It makes us better leaders. They've also found, as I said before, better commitment and engagement. And additionally, one of the things I encourage my graduate students to understand is that if they understand this challenge, it's an advantage to them because they may be the folks that are faced with this challenge, the challenge of leading neurodiverse employees during their career. And understanding the challenge and how to lead it may be a competitive advantage to their careers. Okay, so that's the advantages. So what does the challenge look like? So research at Microsoft indicates that very often neurodiverse employees refuse to self-disclose because they're afraid of negative career consequences. They keep the diagnosis to themselves. And additionally, many of them are not even diagnosed until adulthood. Neurodiverse employees, so you may not have an official piece of paper that says so-and-so has a neurodiverse profile. Many of them are not, I said that already. Neurodiverse employees tend to rigidly interpret rules. One of the anecdotes from the Microsoft research is that if your procedure book says that a certain kind of meeting, a scrum meeting or a design review or whatever, requires that certain 5 people be at that meeting and only 4 of those people show up, as far as the neurodiverse employee is concerned, that meeting hasn't happened yet, and it needs to be done over again. Sometimes that's an advantage. Sometimes it's a barrier. So there are also some issues with inappropriate emotional reactions, especially they found hostile reactions to criticism. So this obviously is a challenge if your culture embraces constructive criticism and actions like design reviews. Okay, so we can make a pretty strong case that we need to modify our leadership toolkit. Great, but how do we do it? How do we decide what modifications to make? So when I first became interested in this topic, I had started my doctoral work, and I had this new toy called the literature search. So I did an exhaustive literature search into the databases about what we know about leading and managing neurodiverse employees. And I came up with 0 hits. So since then, there's been some work that's been done. Alicia Parr did a study of how neurodiverse employees react to transformational leadership. So her results, she did this as part of her doctoral dissertation at Penn State just 2 years ago. So her results were pretty interesting. She found that neurodiverse employees reacted well to 2 of the constructs of transformational leadership, namely the use of charisma and vision by the leader, as well as coaching and advising by the leader. However, inspiring followers through high expectations seems to backfire. She measured an increase in anxiety and a decrease in organizational commitment amongst neurodiverse employees when the leader used this transformational leadership tool of inspiring through high expectations. Okay, this is exactly the opposite of what we're trying to achieve by using transformational leadership. All right. So this is a good start, but you know, this is pretty meager. You know, it fits my construct of connecting the practice of leadership with research results, but this isn't enough. We need more tools in our toolkit than just this modification to the theory of transformational leadership. So what does a good engineer do when you're faced with a problem and you have no data? Well, what you do is you make an educated guess, not a wild guess, an educated guess as to what the data might be, and then you find a way to test it. So my first challenge was how do I make an educated guess about this? So as I said earlier, I had started this work on managing neurodiverse folks prior to beginning my doctoral work in management. But the work on leading the neurodiverse was put on the back burner once it became obvious to me that the doctoral studies were going to completely consume my life. So one day I was on campus at Pace University, and I hit the wrong elevator button. I was trying to get to the 18th floor for lunch, and I hit the 16th floor button instead. And the elevator door opens, and right in front of me is this sign that says Pace University Center for Teaching and Research in Autism. So I thought this was an interesting coincidence, and I went on my way up to the 18th floor to get lunch. And when I shared the story with some of my peers at lunch, one of the guys was pretty convinced that this was not just a coincidence, that this was a sign, and I needed to really start this work again. Now, I'm not really sure if it was a sign or not, but I thought I should certainly make use of this center at Pace University, and I networked my way to the leader of this institute, Mary Cohen, who introduced me to the work of Francesca Hoppe. Now, Francesca Hoppe is a well-respected autism researcher at King's College in London, and her work became fundamental to my effort to figure out how to lead neurodiverse employees. So Francesca Hoppe argues that the autistic mind is not a disabled mind, but a differently abled mind. She argues that autism is often a deep specific skill connected with weak central coherence, or what she calls not getting the gist. So the neurodiverse employee has some deep specific skills that can be used to contribute to the business. Anything from John Robison's amazing ability to do design work to the fellow I talked about who could recall complicated retail procedures out of memory. So they have these skills, but they don't get the gist of what goes on around them. They don't get the social gist. They don't get the gist of social cues, everything that we take for granted as neurotypical people. And this explains why they don't fit in. So to me, this is a very practical definition that as a neurotypical manager, I can use to understand neurodiverse employees. And more importantly than that is to figure out how to modify my approach to manage and lead. So I began wondering what competencies in a typical managerial toolkit are inherently dependent on the employee getting the gist. And if we can figure that out, we can modify our supervisory skills to allow for this weak central coherence or not getting the gist. So this chart, this chart is the supervisor's toolkit that's the basis of my graduate course in leadership. I'm going to spare you the long, involved explanation of why they're on there. I drag my graduate students through that, but you don't need to know that. So I began having discussions with graduate students. I was an adjunct at this time over each of these skills and weak central coherence. We discussed the skill. I'd engage the class with a discussion of what weak central coherence is, and we debate which of these things are inherently dependent on the employee getting the gist. Now, you can make an argument that all of them are dependent on the employee getting the gist, and you'd probably be right, but some of them are more dependent than others. So I arrived at these 4 specific supervisory skills that are highly dependent on the employee getting the gist. So the next step is, how do you modify these so they would be effective with someone who doesn't get the gist? Now, we don't have time to go through all of this today, so let's go through one as an example. Let me walk you through for a few minutes delegation as an example of how to apply this concept of weak central coherence and modifying your leadership approach. So Onken and Wass have authored what is actually the most popular Harvard Business Review paper of all time. It's Management Time, Who's Got the Monkey? You may be familiar with it. It has to do with delegation. So the authors recommended 5 degrees of initiative, and they also recommend that we never allow subordinates to be at level 1 or 2, where they're either waiting to be told or asking what to do. Waiting to be told what to do or asking what to do. And they really encourage us to have employees acting at the 4th and 5th levels, where the employees are acting on their own and either advising us immediately or on some regular basis. But doesn't delegating at these higher levels assume that the employee gets the gist? We're assuming that the employee can look at this new thing that's facing them today and connect the dots to understand that it's really similar to something they have done previously. And therefore, they can figure out what to do. But with an employee that doesn't get the gist, this probably isn't going to work. And I would argue that the 3rd level, where the employee recommends the action to be taken, and then you as the manager agree, disagree, coach them a little bit, may be the sweet spot for managing a neurodiverse people. So I base this on the fact that this concept of gist is a bit fuzzy. Someone once said that when you really get to know someone on the autism spectrum, all you know is one person on the autism spectrum. It is a spectrum, and a lot of folks on this spectrum are very different from each other. So to me, the strength of delegating at level 3 is that it gives you the opportunity to evaluate how much of the gist a specific individual gets. If they get less of the gist, then maybe you need to be delegating to them at level 2. If they get more, maybe you can push it up to level 4. So this delegating at level 3 becomes a diagnostic tool for you as well as a managerial tool. So I said earlier, what a good engineer would do without data is make an educated guess and then test. So my educated guess is based on this concept of weak central coherence from Francesca Hoppe. The test was provided by one of my students. She was the executive director of a service provider in the Lehigh Valley that worked exclusively with folks from this population. So she was awesome. She was very generous. She made her entire staff available to me for a 5-hour workshop. The workshop focused on the 4 skills that were on a previous chart and my recommendations on how to modify these based on the concept of weak central coherence. So the workshop is structured the way I do all my master's education. It's based on actual case stories that students bring in. Not that important. The important thing is at the end of this, I gave this very experienced group of job developers and job coaches the opportunity to give me honest and anonymous feedback on whether I was going down the right path. And these are folks that they're in the front lines. They live this day in, day out. So I needed to know whether I was going down the right direction. This was a pilot test. I was very encouraged by the results. I got a 4.25 on a Likert scale of 1 to 5. The question was, did this workshop help you understand these concepts better and make it more effective for you to apply them? And like I said, I got a 4.25, where 5 was good, where 5 was the good end of the Likert scale. So this encouraged me that this is the correct approach for modifying our managerial and leadership approaches to deal with the neurodiverse. Now look, this is no substitute for science. This is not a substitute for research. We need more research like what Alicia Parr did for her doctoral dissertation to put some science behind the differences in leading the neurotypical and the neurodiverse employees. But research is slow. It takes a long time. And we can't wait. There's a competitive advantage to be gained by tapping into this talent pool. And right now, these guys are suffering from an 80% unemployment rate. So there's some urgency here. We can't wait for research to be available. And until then, my argument is we use this concept of deep specific skills coupled with weak central coherence to empower the neurodiverse to make contributions to their business and establish their own financial independence. Yeah, there's my my Likert scale, the 4.25. So before we wrap up, I want to say just a few words about interviewing. Unfortunately, there's no science on this at this time. So when I teach interviewing, I base it on the evaluation interview approach by Richard Fear. It's been around since the Second World War. It's been used by a lot of big companies successfully. I've used it personally in my career with a lot of success. But Richard Fear approach makes recommendations that are probably not going to work well with the neurodiverse. For starters, he recommends you open with small talk to make the candidate feel comfortable. Now, one of the things Jane Brown brought to this Autism at Work workshop or summit a couple of weeks ago is that her experience is small talk doesn't work with the neurodiverse. It may backfire. It may make the candidate feel uncomfortable. So Richard Fear approach goes on to differentiate between job screen and quality screen. You know, this is to avoid the old joke of hiring someone for what they know and then firing them for who they are. So testing the quality screen is an attempt to understand who the candidate is in addition to what they know. And we try to test these quality screen things like results orientation, analytic ability, all this stuff. And the way that Fear recommends we do this is we ask about specific things from their work history, from the resume, and we guide the stories that they're telling us to get to harvest inferences about these quality screens that we may be interested in. Well, this is a tough thing to do with a neurotypical candidate. I mean, this is really challenging as an interviewer. And when someone who doesn't get the gist and doesn't know what you're asking them to tell them, it may be very, very difficult. So what do we do? Okay, so great. So what do we do? I love this quote, right? That you can't judge a fish by its ability to climb a tree. So when interviewing the neurodiverse, we know that small talk doesn't work. They're not going to look you in the eye, probably. They're probably not going to give you the firm handshake. You know, they may not get enough of the gist to make the Richard Fear interview technique work. In other words, all the typical approaches that we rely on for interviewing candidates probably not a good fit when we're trying to find neurodiverse talent. What does work is the ability to observe performance. I spoke with a small manufacturing company a few weeks ago that recruited a neurodiverse worker into their production department directly from high school. This is working out great for both the business and the individual. They recruited this fellow through an internship where he got to see the company was all about, and the company got to evaluate him as a performer while he was performing. The software company SAP has started what they refer to as an enterprise readiness program. So this brings potential neurodiverse talent into the business for several weeks during the summer and has them work together on a team. Potential hiring managers can observe how they work together and what kind of results they get. So, and then they make an evaluation, a hiring evaluation based on that. This is very different from the typical 30 or 60-minute interview that we've all been trained to do. Apprenticeships have also been suggested by none other than John Elder Robeson as a way to both educate and also evaluate neurodiverse employees. So there's not a lot known about this yet, but this is what we do know at this point in time. So in a broader sense, we're only beginning to understand the effective leadership of the neurodiverse, but you do have the beginning of a toolkit. let's reiterate what we do know. So probably the most important tool is the concept of deep specific skills and weak central coherence. Use this concept of folks perhaps not getting the gist as a guide to modifying your leadership approach. You also have some specific recommendations on the management skill of delegation. And you have an appreciation of the very early stage understanding of interviewing and evaluating neurodiverse talent for potential hiring. So look, this is not as complete as the toolkits that my graduate students build, but we've only been here for 45 minutes. But it's a beginning. And my challenge to you is to take this toolkit, as nascent as it is, experiment with it, find out how to make it work in your specific situation. And what you can do then is make your corner of the world a better place. You can make yourself a better manager. You can provide opportunities for neurodiverse talent, and you can make your company more competitive based on the deep specific skills of this talent. So thank you. And I guess it's time for questions.
Hi, Tom. Thank you very much for the presentation. Before we open up for questions, we just wanted to apologize for the technical difficulties during the beginning of the presentation. However, we're going to be sending out a copy of the slides in a PDF format to everyone's email who attended today. And I would like to open it up for questions. So if you have a question, please type it in the box at the bottom and I will read them off to Tom. Is it easy to recognize someone on the spectrum during a first interview?
Wow, that's a great question. I probably don't have a great answer for it though. I always encourage my students to be really careful in trying to start diagnosing people. A little bit of knowledge is a dangerous thing. And I don't want my students who are going to be engineering leaders pretending that they're psychologists and they can make this diagnosis. I mean, there's diagnostic tools. I mean, this is not a trivial thing to diagnose. So, my recommendation is always to try to judge, again, relying on this concept of weak central coherence. Do you think the individual you're talking to is not getting the gist? They've got some skills, they've got some abilities, they don't get the gist. So you have to help them navigate that. So if that's the case, if that's what you're faced with, and you can get the advantages of the deep specific skill by helping them navigate the lack of getting the gist, do you really care what the diagnosis is? I mean, I don't. Because there could be a situation where someone would not be diagnosed by the official tool, but they're really, really close. Well, that doesn't mean we stop applying this concept to that individual. So I'd avoid thinking that it's on you to do the diagnosis. In fact, that's probably, there's some hazards in terms of HR policies when you do that. I would stick to the fact of that, I've been trained to do things as a leader. I understand now that these things have the assumption that the employee gets the gist of what goes on around them baked into these procedures. If I see evidence they're not getting the gist, I got to change my approach.
Okay, since there's no more questions, I'm going to pass the webinar back over to Jasmine. Jasmine?
Yes. Okay, thank you again to today's speakers for taking the time to share their knowledge with us. Thank you, each of you, for joining us for today's webinar. As a reminder, please look out for the follow-up email with the link to the survey. Be sure to complete the survey in order to receive HRCI and SHRM credits. And visit www.phillyshrm.org to register for other upcoming events. We encourage you to check out the Philly SHRM website for updates on all of our upcoming programs. On behalf of Philly SHRM, thanks again and enjoy your afternoon.